So I forgot to mention this last time, so I want to go through it at least briefly here. Is the Phase 3 doc is up. So the big, as I mentioned before, as you know was coming, the big thing for Phase 3 is adding, I should actually change that, is adding user accounts to your application, to your web app, and really finishing up all the functionality of it. The functionality that remains all relies on user accounts being a thing. So we're going to add user accounts and then finish up all that extra functionality. There is a decent amount that goes into this. It probably is the most complicated phase, I'd say. But we do have some time to work it out. And we have, after today, there's no more lecture content that you're required to do on an assignment. So we can focus on Phase 3 and how to design a whole app for the last 2 weeks of the semester. And speaking of, for the last 2 weeks, anything you want to see, I'll take requests and talk about whatever y'all want to talk about. So for Phase 3, especially those of you who are watching the lecture, if there's something y'all want to see, I'd be fine with that, having you decide what we talk about for those last few weeks. So with the user accounts, the last pieces of functionality we want to add are DMs and friends and follows. These are things that we couldn't do at all with Phase 2 without user accounts. These requirements were just blank. There was nothing to do for those without user accounts. If it's just one single user, what's a DM mean? Like, what the whole point of a DM is that it's private between the two people communicating. That one person can send a direct message to the other one, and those two people are the only two who can view that message. So the big part of a DM is that privacy, is making sure only those two users can see those DMs. Phase 2, a single user, that just didn't make sense. That didn't make much sense. With a single user, DMs are basically chat. And then friending and following, or following users, whatever you want it to be, but there should be some way for users to mark other users and have something different happen based on that marking. So it's typically friending or following. Friends, you can see your friends list. Maybe you can only DM your friends. You follow people, maybe their content rises to the top of your newsfeed on a more regular basis. Maybe they're all at the top of your newsfeed and then everything else is shown. Maybe you get alerts whenever somebody you follow posts content. Whatever it is, there should be some way for you to say, this user, mark them, and then something different happens. Hell, if you want, it could even be something negative. If you can, maybe you ban users. You say, I don't want to see posts from this user anymore, ban them, and then those posts don't show up on your app anymore. So whatever you have, whatever functionality you and your team have designed for that, there should be some way of marking other users and getting served different content based on that marking. Whatever that means to you. I tried to word that as vaguely as possible to allow you the most flexibility in how you actually design the functionality of your app. I'm concerned about you going through the technical aspect of this. How do you store that marking in the database under a user? How do you get that functionality and go through the logistics of pulling from the database when you get requests from this user, checking their followed list or their friends list or their banned list. How do you go through the technical logistics of that? And then as far as the design, it's up to you what you want that to actually be based on the design of your site. I wrote this, I mentioned this before, but it's worth repeating. I wrote these requirements broadly enough and vaguely enough that any idea for a web app, social media web app that you have should be feasible in here. Even if you came into this class and you're like, oh man, I wanted to make a game. Well, a game fits into these criteria. That's one thing I made sure that you can make this work. Even if you want to build a game, of course you would be doing a lot of extra requirements, but you can make all these work, no matter what your idea is for a social media app. And then, of course, adding the user accounts themselves. The big part here is handling the login, marking them as logged in when they are logged in, and having that login persist and having their account persist. So somebody creates an account, logs on, follows a user, logs off, and then you restart the server. I don't know. Actually, I don't know if I explicitly wrote that requirement. It should be in here. You should persist over restart. If I didn't write it in here, I won't hold you to it. But I at the very least meant for that to be a requirement. But it should at least persist across logins. If somebody logs out, because I did make sure I wrote that one there, log out, log back in, and on a different device, different IP address, different everything, but the same credentials. Their friend list, their follow list, their DMs, everything should be there. Be there still. There's this requirement that something should be custom based on a user being logged in and authenticated as themselves. That technically is a requirement of the user accounts, but that functionality is covered by any of the functionality down here. So if you don't get any of the other functionality, then having something different, welcome username, like for homework 8, you could just say welcome username or whatever. If you want to do that here and get some partial credit, I made sure I put that there so you get that partial if you don't get the other features working. But if you get either one of these two features working, friends, follows, or DMs, if you get either one of those or restricting voting to once per user, anything that's different based on being logged in, that'll take care of that requirement. So you don't have to do anything extra for this requirement in user accounts. That's just a partial credit opportunity if you don't get the other things. And then voting, we've walked through this in class, how to restrict the voting. I showed you one method of how to do that, so I don't have to dwell on that too much. And with the DMs, this is one of the big parts. This is something we can talk about next week. If some of you are struggling on how to design this, we can talk about that. That can be one of the full app design architecture things that we talk about next week. You have all the technology to be able to do this. You can do this, but I can show you examples and guide you a little more if you want. But when somebody gets a DM, they should receive that DM immediately, whatever that means for your app. If it's a notification in the corner of the screen, if the DM itself pops up right away, whatever that means for your app, they should be able to see that DM immediately as soon as the other user sends it. This should be real time, so think WebSockets. WebSockets, unless you're bold enough to go for long polling, or you have a good long polling library, but it should be real time. I send someone a DM, they should see that DM immediately. If that other user is not currently online, the next time they log in, they should be able to see that DM. They should get some notification, some on the splash home screen, their newsfeed or whatever. There should be some section, here are your DMs. However you want to design it, however you want those DMs to work. But a DM should not be lost just because the recipient was not online at that moment. So there's a lot of tracking, not just user sessions based on authentication tokens, but also tracking whether or not a user is currently online. This can be done, I said we can talk about it next week, but I'll give you a quick overview of one way to be able to do this. Is if you're using WebSockets, which I highly recommend, you should be using WebSockets. If you're using WebSockets, then when somebody makes a connection, a WebSocket connection that's going to persist, when they make that connection, store a reference to that socket and store it in a way that it's connected to their username. So have some data structure or even something in your database, though this doesn't need to be in the database because when you restart the server, all the WebSockets are not going to persist. So this data doesn't have to persist. So anyway, but store some data structure mapping usernames to WebSockets. So when you get a DM, you can say, okay, is this username that this is being sent to, this message is being sent to, is that username in my data structure of usernames to WebSockets? And of course, when somebody disconnects a WebSocket, remove them from that data structure. If they're in that data structure, send them the DM right away. Say, hey, you got a DM, here's your notification. If they're not in that data structure, save that DM in a database. The DM itself you should save in a database anyway. Save that DM in a database, and then next time they log in, have some check at login that's going to go to that database, check for all the new DMs, and send them all their new DM notifications. Anything that's not marked as read already. And then when they read it, mark it as read. Don't notify them every time they log in about all the DMs that they've already read. So that's one overview. That's one way you can build that. Not necessarily the only way, but that's the way I'd recommend to be able to get that functionality. But there's a decent amount of complexity in a direct message feature, having to track user sessions like that. Whereas like somebody shares content, or chat like we saw in class, you're just broadcasting content to everybody. It's a bit different when you're sending it to a select user. It's not too complicated. It's just some data structures and some memory, some data management and things like that. But there is a decent amount that goes into it. If you haven't thought about that already, just pointing that out explicitly, that there's a good amount that goes into a good usable DM feature for an app. Is there anything else? I mean, for completeness, I might as well just mention the other things. That when somebody shares content, that should be associated with them. When somebody makes a comment, that should be associated with them. This is as simple as what most apps do. Just slap their username right next to that thing. One thing I would recommend, I don't think I did end up explicitly recommending it. I think I typed it up and ended up deleting it, but I'll recommend it verbally here, is when somebody shares comments or posts a comment, right next to that comment or post, whenever you put their username on the site and say this content is for this username, I would put two buttons right next to their username, a friend or follow button and a DM button. And then it can really reduce the complexity of your interface design. Instead of trying to say, I want to DM a user, where do I go to DM a user? You would have to build some separate part of your site there. Maybe you can only DM your friends. So you go to your friends list, that list shows, and then you can DM them there. You can reduce a lot of design choices and a lot of design complexity if right next to each time you put that user's name, slap that friend, follow, DM, put those buttons right next to their name, and then you can open up that functionality without getting too complex in your front end design and your user experience design. And security, of course. Let me skip ahead a little bit because these other ones are easy to talk about. Docker Compose, same requirements as Phase 2. This is literally cut and paste from Phase 2. Video, there's no video for this phase. There is a separate submission for the final presentation video that's due on the day of the scheduled final exam. That is what I went with, right? I just want to double check. In my own way. Yeah, so I made it due that same day as the final exam was scheduled, where we were going to have the last chance to do a presentation. So I made it due at midnight that night instead of that morning. So that'll be a separate submission. I'll have that doc up fairly soon to have the requirements of the presentation that'll be due. It'll be a video. It'll be a YouTube video. So unfortunately, like I mentioned before, we do lose the actual presentation aspect of it, which is sad, but you know, it is what it is. With this online only thing, there's only so much we can do. So that'll be a separate submission. So for this phase, you're only worried about the code, the functionality, building this app. And then after that submission, you'll have a few more days to work on the video as a separate submission. And then the submission for this one, the form is really simple. I'm not going to be logged in. The form is really simple. If you want a different subdomain for your app, right now they're all Team X, Team 1, Team 2, Team 3. I'll keep the team numbers. I'll keep those subdomains. But if you want, in addition to that, another subdomain of your choosing, so you can have whatever you choose, ourcoolapp.cse-software.com. You can choose that subdomain. I'll add it to my Nginx setup, my Nginx configuration, and you'll have that domain name. So presumably after phase 3, you'll have this app in pretty good order. Should be usable at that point, and I'll be hosting it for you. If you don't want to say, hey, everybody, want to use my app, it's called team5.whatever, .ccsoftware.com. Instead, you can actually personalize that. So I'll offer that to you. I'll do that. Do that legwork to set that up. Just fill out the form and choose that subdomain that you'd prefer, that your team would prefer. All right, so the last thing, or of course, you can always host these yourself if you want your whole own domain name and things like that. Or you can rely on my hosting. I'll leave these hosted after the class is over. There's no reason to take them down. And finally, security. So this is a bigger one to talk about. The security vulnerabilities are a huge threat if you're out there building software that is insecure. That's you can end up doing a lot more damage than you're doing good for your company, your users, your career. A lot of things there are serious consequences to having security vulnerabilities. So that'll be the same in this class. If you have a security vulnerability, you'll be at the mercy of my decision how severe I think the vulnerability is. I'll make a decision up to a 0 for the entire phase. Your whole team just might get a 0 for phase 3 if I think it's a really egregious, completely blatant security risk that the team just clearly didn't think about security. It's just going to be a 0 for phase 3. If it's a more minor thing where you were clearly addressing security issues, but you did have a loophole, there'll still be some hit in the grade, but it won't be as severe as just a flat out 0. So we have the two that we've talked about before. If you're vulnerable to HTML injection, JavaScript injection, this one I consider severe. I mean, anybody, even somebody who doesn't even know anything about programming or security or anything, they're still going to be able to pull off this attack. Maybe they can't inject the JavaScript and steal cookies if the cookies are insecure. Maybe they can't do that, but at the very least, they can bring down your entire site very easily. They can just destroy the whole site. Oh, thank you, Tom. I was getting worried chat was broken because I didn't see any chat earlier. In the MERN stack, if we try to replace HTML characters, it will display them changed like ampersand. I mean, that's something you're going to have to look at. That's not the MERN stack. That's the way you have it used. It will display that if you print it to your console, but when it's rendered in the browser, ampersand LT semicolon is rendered in the browser as the less than symbol. So it depends where you're viewing those characters. If you have them properly escaped, if it's rendered like that, you might have called escape twice on the same string. I would look for something like that. Because if you have that and then you also escape that ampersand again, then you're going to actually get the ampersand LT semicolon. That's the first thing I would look at. Make sure you're not escaping your strings twice if you're getting those rendered like that. Or it's possible that you're somewhere in your stack, it's also escaping your characters and then you're manually escaping them a second time. Might be something that's going on. Those are the things I would look at. I would try removing whatever escaping you're doing and then try to inject some HTML. If you can't inject HTML, then somewhere in your stack, some of that software in there is already taking care of the escaping. That's what I'd look into. But if you're vulnerable to that, that's a severe thing. Everybody can take down your site. And it's like the first thing we talk about in terms of security, we talk about it constantly. It's always a constant topic. Every time I have a chat app or deploy it, you can see the attacks come in. Not always attacks, but people testing me to make sure that I have my HTML injection, my HTML escape. It's a very common thing. Anybody in this arena knows about it. It's something you better be protecting against. It's the first thing somebody's going to attack your site with. And as it should be. It's a very simple attack. If you're not protecting against that, you can get hacked by a freaking 5-year-old. My 5-year-old daughter would probably be able to hack you at that point. Maybe not compromise the privacy of your users, but they'll take down your site pretty quick. Just my favorite, just an open comment in HTML, open block comment, and then everything after that is just wiped out. Unless you have a comment somewhere in that code. SQL injection, make sure you're using prepared statements. This is how we're going to look for that. If you're using MySQL or some other SQL database server and you're not preparing your statements, that's a big one. And then the new ones, securing your user accounts. In general, private content must be private. We have user accounts. If, say, for example, somebody not logged in is one of the two users involved in a DM, can still access that DM. That's a security issue. That's a privacy issue. And also user accounts. If someone is able to easily, practically I took a while thinking of what word to use here. I said easily, but like, what does easily mean? There shouldn't be a practical attack that somebody can take to log in as another user, even if they have access to your password database. If they have access to your user's database, they should still not be able to authenticate as somebody else. The cookies, the whatever you're using for your cookies to make an authenticated session persist, those should be secure enough that that nobody can steal those easily. We'll be looking for that stuff. And in general, make sure with the private content must be private. Make sure that the every aspect of your server, every piece of content your server serves, if it's private content, make sure you're checking that this user is authenticated before you serve that content. Don't just assume that, well, that DM link, I only sent that to that user. Like, there's no way to get that link without already being authenticated and having us serve that HTML with that link in it. Do not rely on that, because anybody who logs in finds that link, and then maybe that link, part of the URL, has the username in it, and if they can just swap out that username, send a request that they shouldn't really be allowed to make, they can still make that request because they can just type it into their browser, or they can write some custom code that makes a post request with the proper cookies set and everything, or they can use something like Postman to make those requests. There are a lot of ways to make requests without going through your front end. So make sure everything is authenticated. Make sure you're always checking that the user is authenticated. I think it's a React thing. It will treat any string as actual string. Good. And I actually had that issue before. I was trying to set up a lecture example of a site that's vulnerable to HTML injection. And I forget what I was using, but whatever stack I was using for that example, I just could not open myself up to a vulnerability. There was something in that stack. That's why I thought of that right away. There was something in that stack that was protecting me against HTML injection. And I was trying to set up this example for a lecture to let students break a live site, and I just couldn't set up. So I had to draw. But this is before 332 was even a thought. So I had to draw on some of that knowledge, that future 332 content, and build a website from scratch just so I could open myself up to a vulnerability. So yeah, some stacks, some technologies do this for you. They don't let you do anything insecure. Dangerously set enter HTML. That's fun. I guess that's fine. That's a fine check to do on the front end too, because if somebody's removing a protection for themselves, that's not too much of a concern. They can't really hurt other users doing that. All right. Any questions on phase 3? Okay. Put together a few slides on streaming. Some of it recovers some of Wednesday's lecture and puts them in slide format. Some of it's a little new. And then we'll go into some examples. We'll go back into the code. And I'll show you a few things. Do some examples of this ffmpeg library. So we've seen HLS and how to play HLS videos. We got a video player that can play these videos, whereas the default built-in HTML5 video tag the browser built-in video player, we can't rely on that playing HLS. There are some browsers that do support it, but some don't, notably desktop Chrome and Firefox, which desktop Chrome, that's a good portion of our users. I say desktop because mobile Chrome on an Android does support HLS for what it's worth. Don't ask me why, but a lot of web traffic, a lot of your users will not natively support HLS. So we pulled in a library. We pulled in an open source video player that can support HLS, and then we played our HLS videos in the browser using that new player. So the problem is our users are typically not going to give us videos in HLS format. It's not a common format for just regular people to use outside of web servers and hosting content. If you're sitting down on your machine to watch a video, there's nothing wrong with an MP4. But if you're streaming it over the internet, HLS is nice. As we talked about before, the multiple bit rates is the big thing that we want. So let's use ffmpeg to get this HLS functionality. So ffmpeg is software that will, but any check in the back end will cause React to display stuff. That is kind of awkward. Maybe you do. I mean, I wouldn't recommend using the dangerously set inner HTML, but I feel like you should. I would want all of my data escaped on the back end. What if, what if you're viewing that data through some other front end? But it's so scary just using that dangerously set inner HTML. Any method name that. Ooh. But ffmpeg, this is software that needs to be installed on your machine. So when you install, if you run your code, if you ran the examples that'll show, then the examples we played with last time, during I think that was only during Q&A, wasn't it? If you play around with some examples, you're going to get errors if you don't have ffmpeg installed. Command not found. Your program might crash. Nothing's going to work quite right if you don't have the software installed. So this is software completely independent of our code. So we have this case where our program is no longer self-isolated, which is most of the code that you write for classes. Dare I say all, until you're working with a database, is probably the big one where you're not self-contained anymore. But your software is not self-contained. You're relying on a separate program being installed on the machine, on the host machine on which your code is running. So something to be aware of, ffmpeg is a separate piece of software that's being called from your code. So there's an extra dependency that's not a library. It's actually other software, other commands that are being called. I guess depending on how you look at it, you could see it as a library. It's just a compiled library. It doesn't. Well, most libraries are compiled, right? That doesn't make sense. But anyway, it's a separate executable. Maybe that's the best word. To be able to run this from your code, you should add the ffmpeg executable to your path variable. So when you type in the command ffmpeg in your command line, no matter what directory you're in, you should be able to run that program. That happens by adding it to your path variable, your environment variable named path. This exists on all the major operating systems. They all have a path variable which has the same functionality. It's a list of directories where your operating system will look for programs with a particular name when you try to run that program via the command line. So when you go to the command line and type ffmpeg, your OS is going to look at your path variable, which is a list of directories, and look through all those directories for an executable named ffmpeg. If it finds one, it's going to run that program. If it doesn't find one, it says, I don't know what you're talking about, and throws an error. So you have to add it to your path variable so you can run this from anywhere, most notably from your code, from wherever your project is running, wherever that working directory is going to be. And then you can use the command line to call ffmpeg to use this program, which is, in at least one way, we'll talk about it, the only way you can use this software is running it, giving it commands, running the program with some command line arguments. It's not, for example, it's not like a MySQL server where it's another service that's running that we connect to it with TCP and send it commands via TCP. This is a process. We have to run it in some way. Even if we're not literally opening up the command line, we have to call this program somehow. We have to run this code. So here's some example usage of ffmpeg. This is the most basic command that you can have, the most trimmed down example that you can have. Calling ffmpeg itself, pull up the software. We're going to use the -i flag to specify an input video. If you're not used to command line arguments, there's usually a flag which is either a standalone flag or a flag that takes an argument. This is a flag that takes an argument, so the -i flag has to be followed by the value associated with that flag. So I'm saying I'm about to specify the input file, and this is the input file name that I want to send to the program. And then the last argument that we're going to specify is the output video, the output file name. So this command right here is going to say, hey, ffmpeg, I have this input video. Can you create a copy of this video with this file name? And since I'm switching the file extension, ffmpeg is going to look at this file extension and say, whoa, that doesn't match what you're giving me. So you must be asking me to convert this video from AVI to MP4. And then it's going to go and do that conversion, create this output video, and then I have an MP4 copy of my video in this different format after I run this command. So this is the minimum of what we need: an input file and an output file, and then we can add extra commands onto this. So there's tons of commands. I recommend, if you're interested in this stuff at all, this is one of the things I wish I had more time just to play around with, is if you're interested in this stuff at all, take a look at the library, take a look at the documentation and examples, and see all the stuff you can do with this library. I keep calling it a library. With this software, there's tons of stuff you can do. For this one, just as an example of how to use it, you can add more flags and more arguments before the output video name. So the output video file name is always going to be the very last. I'm sure there's probably some exception to that, but it will be the very last argument that you give. So you're always ending with the output file name, and then before the output file name, you can specify the output file arguments. So here I'm going to add in this area here, before that, right before that output file name, any arguments that I want to change how it's going to encode that output video. And in this one, I'm going to scale it. I'm going to give it the scale flag, and then specify the resolution of the output video. And ideally, of course, you should match the aspect ratio of the input video. You know, things like that should make sense. Here, if I have a widescreen video input, maybe I have an HD widescreen video input, and I want to scale it down to a lower resolution, but still stay in the widescreen aspect ratio. So I'll specify that lower encoding, get my 640 video, and then output file name. So we can add lots of options, and the library has tons of things. You saw grayscale in the previous lecture. We can do some filtering here. We can crop. You can do all kinds of stuff with this software. It's very powerful. There's a reason why it's. I'm finding out there's a reason why it's the most popular video processing software. As far as I can tell, it seems to be the most popular one. At the very least, with people who are using the command line, this is the way to do it. The way to process videos. Obviously, you would use some fancier software if you're doing things manually. But if you're doing things programmatically, you have software that needs to process video. It seems to be the way to do it. And for our purposes, here's a minimal example of converting from MP4 to M3 U8. So I know I'm just going to see this pretty much exactly in all your submissions, but hey, that is what it is. ffmpeg, based on the file extension of the output file, is going to infer is going to attempt to infer the output type. So when we had MP4, when we had AVI and MP4, it said, oh, MP4, I know all about that. I'm going to use MP4 encoding and encode this video in MP4. With M3U8, that's a little different. With M3U8, there's no guarantee that that's going to be an HLS video. The M3U8 playlist file format is used for a lot of other things other than HLS only. HLS happens to use this format, but it's not the only thing that uses that format. So we do have to specify, we have to add another option and explicitly tell ffmpeg, hey, use the HLS file format. We use the format flag and say, hey, I'm about to specify the format, the output file format, and then say HLS. I want this to be an HLS file. And at this point, this is where we could add a lot more arguments. The example I was playing with last time, I don't remember if it was during Q&A or lecture, but the example I played with last time had a lot more arguments. An example, I just pulled it off the internet, I think during the example. Had a lot more arguments. You can specify how long each file should be. You can set the resolution like we did in the previous example. You can you can set, I forgot, I'm blanking on the name, master frames. It was kind of like what we were talking about with MP4s, of how often you have a full frame of full information. But there are lots of parameters that you can have with this HLS to fine-tune both the quality and the structure of that stream. Do you want a lot of files that are smaller and send and have the user make lots of requests for really small files? Do you want them to be kind of larger and have them make fewer requests for larger files? Depending on what you want, what you need, what works best for your setup. There's lots of tweaking that you can do, lots of parameters you can set. And that's really, and that's the bare bones. You can play with those parameters and get better options. If you want to do, not required by your homework, but if you wanted to do a multiple, what am I trying to say? Multiple qualities, multiple bit rates, which is my one big selling point still with HLS. If you want to do multiple bit rates, you have to make sure that each file for each bit rate has the same length of video attached to it. So if you have 12 files all of 2 seconds in your high quality video, for your low quality video, you also have to have 12 files each of 2 seconds. And the reason for that is the stream, the user is going to want to switch between those qualities at will. So if you're watching the high quality video and your internet drops off, you don't want to, you want to be able to pick up right where you left off. So just the next .ts file that you grab the lower quality one of that same, for that same segment of the video. So you do have to use those parameters to make sure that the video is chopped up in the same way for each quality. So you do need to use those if you want to use multiple bit rates for your video. There are a few ways to run ffmpeg. So we just showed command line arguments, but you have to run this in your code. So how do you get ffmpeg running in your code? And I said the command line is the only way to use this. So in our code, we have to make those command line calls. So there's a few options here and that you can use. One, make a system call. So in each programming language, built into the language is a way to make calls to your command line. You can give it the command line string and say, run this in my command line. Go pull up bash and run this command, and it'll run that command. This is the same as just typing that command into the command line. So what the examples that we saw, you would take those examples and put them directly in the command line. And for the homework, I'm actually going to switch my recommendation. I was saying I recommend the bindings because it makes things simpler. I actually do recommend option 1 for the homework because the command isn't too complicated that you have to use to do that conversion. So I would just make a system call and keep it simpler, which gives you full control over how you make that call. The other option, if you're doing more complicated stuff, if beyond this course you want to do some video processing, you want to do some stuff with video for your project this semester, and you just want more functionality, more features, maybe you're just playing with it during a hackathon, you want to do some cool video processing, and you want more complex functionality without getting drowned in command line arguments, because these commands, these can get extremely long if you're doing some fairly complex video processing. For that, you would download some bindings for ffmpeg for your language of choice. Find the popular binding library for ffmpeg, and that's going to give you better syntax, especially when you get to complex operations, complex calls of this stuff. Why do I not have my phone on silent? When you get to more complex calls and lots of parameters, it's going to give you methods to be able to call and have real method names instead of remembering, wait, what does -f mean? What does -i mean? What does -s mean? Instead of remembering all these single variable names, single character variable names, it's going to give you method names that says set resolution, set format, whatever. So it's going to make your code easier to read, easier to revisit in the future after you forgot how what all those flags mean, and give you that syntax that's more human readable, more human friendly, instead of working with those command line arguments. And then the library is going to make the system call for you. So the library is still going to do option 1. It's just adding a layer between you and the command line, so you can work in your programming language instead of the command line language for ffmpeg. So it's somewhat a matter of preference. If you're comfortable with the command line, you can do complex stuff right here. It's fine. But if you want that change syntax, you can use the bindings. And there was something. I'll go there. I'll go there when we go to the code. I was going to show a quick example, try to squeeze it in between slides, but now, real quick, I'm just going to talk about this. We're not going to have examples of this. Maybe the class in the future will have some live streaming, but I, at the very least, want to mention it. We've talked about video this much. I want to at least have a few slides on how to do live streaming, especially since we're pulling in HLS, which can be really used for live streaming. So we've talked about uploading an MP4 and then hosting it with HLS so users can stream that video as they consume it. This is similar to YouTube. YouTube doesn't use HLS. They have their own custom built functionality, but this is custom built protocols and video encodings and everything. But this is the functionality that we get. Users can upload videos. Those videos are shared with all other users. And then users consume that content on demand. They stream it as they view it, but it's on demand. So, but how would we build a live streaming service like what we're watching right now with Twitch? How do we build that functionality using what we know about videos and ffmpeg and all this stuff in HLS? So how do we stream with Twitch? And the procedure I'm going to go through, this is actually how Twitch does it. This is the way they do their technology. So it relies on this rtmp, real-time messaging protocol, to be able to connect to a server and send a stream of information. Constant stream with no, unlike HTML where you're sending a content length. I guess you can use HTML other ways. Let's not do that. But it's going to make a persistent connection and continuously stream the video content to the server. So a client is going to download some software like OBS, like I'm looking at right now. Download OBS. OBS is going to take the video stream, video content, package it into an rtmp stream, and then send that to Twitch or whatever streaming service you're using. It's going to send that with that rtmp connection. The server is going to be listening for rtmp connections and read video from that stream. It's going to ingest this video. And typically we have API keys installed here. If you set up Twitch or YouTube Live or anything, you have some API key to be able to verify the user. You don't just trust a stream and say, oh, they claim to be this user. But you're also not in a browser, so you can't just rely on the cookies being sent. I'm on desktop software. It doesn't talk It doesn't talk to my browser and share cookies, of course, because that'd be a horrible security risk. So we usually rely on API keys for this. So an API key, we haven't really talked about this. It's kind of a topic that that just doesn't come up in the path of the course. I'll talk about it briefly right here. But it's similar to an authentication token. It's a very long, random string of characters, just randomly generated characters with high entropy. And you log into your account on the browser. You get issued your API key. It's very similar to that authentication token, but you take that API key and give that to any, attach that to any requests that you're making offline or through any other software that's not talking to your browser, not part of your browser. So when you go to OBS, you say, I want to start streaming on Twitch. It's going to say, okay, what's your Twitch API key? You enter that key, and then when OBS makes a connection to Twitch, it's going to send the API key. Twitch does the same thing that it does with cookies, with authentication tokens and cookies. Takes that API key, looks it up in the database, sees that it's mine, verifies that it is me, unless I've shared my key with somebody else because the entropy is so high. They're going to verify that it's me, and then associate that stream with me. This is used often if you're using APIs out there on the web. API keys are the standard fare for that domain. So we get an rtmp connection. We're getting a stream of video. We get an API key to tell who this video is from, and then we're going to process that video. To process that video, we're going to read that video in chunks. Convert it, and I should specify, this is just one way to do it. There are, of course, other ways. We're going to read that video in chunks, and then each chunk convert to HLS as we go. So each time, we're going to read a chunk, convert it to HLS, and generate an M3U8 file, an index file, and also all the .ts files. We're going to generate all those files as the video comes in. We're going to continuously process that as the video is coming in. When a client visits the stream, they say, hey, this person's live, I want to consume their content. They're going to request an M3U8 file, and that file is going to have all the latest TS files that have been processed. It's going to give you, say, okay, here are the .ts files that you can download. They're ready, or I would assume Twitch would go a little bit in the future. I would guess that they would do a little optimization there. Say, these are the files that will be ready. We're working on them. By the time you request them, we should have them ready. I would assume they do it like that. And then whenever the client's running low on content, you have some JavaScript in your front end that's going to say, whoa, you're getting close to the end of your M3U8. It's going to go to the server and request a new M3U8. It's going to say, hey, do you have new content for me? Get that new index file. The index file has all the latest TS files, and you just continuously do that as long as you're watching the stream. So this is something that couldn't be done with MP4. I mean, I shouldn't say couldn't. You could set up some crazy way to get it working. Process the video in MP4 chunks and constantly tell the user, hey, here are the file names for the new chunks. Could happen, but this is where HLS is going to shine. Is you don't know the end of the video. You don't know where the video is going to end. So you have to chop it up into chunks, and then whenever a chunk's ready for the user, you can have let that user consume that content. So this is a way that we can get that live streaming. We've been talking about streaming, but live streaming is that next step of being able to process video, chop it into chunks, process it in chunks, more importantly, process it in chunks, and then send it to the user through these index files. The user keeps requesting index files to figure out where the latest files are. And then we can still encode in multiple bit rates as this video is coming in. So so we still have the feature where if a user's internet goes has a hiccup or something, we can still convert to a lower bit rate and then go back up to a higher bit rate if they get their internet back. And this is how Twitch does it. They ingest through an rtmp stream. They convert to HLS, and they host the M3U8s and the .ts's. And you can watch this in your browser. You can see you'll request an M3U8 with a few files. You'll consume some of that content, request another M3U8, and just continue that as long as you're watching the stream. When the way Twitch has it set up, when they convert to HLS, they're hosting these M3U8s, getting the TS like I just described. They do not do more. I mean, maybe they do some, but in terms of file formats, they don't do more processing for the VODs. So the videos that you watch on demand, those are the same videos that you watch if you're watching the live stream. So if you watch a video on demand, you can see, you know, the M3U8, since it's a completely processed full video, the M3U8 is going to have all of the TS files for the entire video because it's all ready, it's all processed. We have a clear end time and everything. But those are the same TS files. Presumably, maybe they have some optimization somewhere. But it's the same format, same HLS format, whether you're watching live or on demand. So I would guess that they're not processing the video multiple times. They're just process it once, and whether you're watching it live or on demand. And what to remember buffering. I won't talk too much about this slide. We've been through all this. But we have large files again, like we had with images. One thing, don't submit your video files if you have like a 100 meg video file you're testing with. Don't submit that to Autolab. For past assignments, we just jacked up the max file submission. With videos, this is going to be a bit much. So just don't include those large videos. If you have like a 5 megabyte video that you want to include, go for it. But and I'll make sure the max file size is decently large. I'll probably set it to like 50 megabytes or something. But don't submit those huge video files to Autolab. Will start just taking up a lot of storage for no reason. With buffering, just recall really quickly, read the content length, and then read from your stream, from your TCP connection, until you read that many bytes. So whatever the content length is, keep reading, go in a loop, keep receiving bytes until you get that many bytes, however many bytes the content length specified. So you're not just making one call to receive, getting the whole request and then processing the request. You have to buffer if that content length is larger than your buffer, larger than the number of bytes that you've read in the body of the request. So from the body of the request, make sure you're not counting the bytes of the header for the content length. Content length is only the length of the body of the request. And also, multi-part is going to make a comeback. These videos have to be uploaded with a multi-part post request. So make sure you're remembering how to handle those. Look for the boundaries and that stuff. And just a question. We're surprisingly out of time. I thought I'd have time to go through the examples today. I spent a while talking about phase 3, but I think that's time well spent. What if the user uploads a video that's larger than your RAM? So this isn't, if with the buffer technique that I just mentioned, if they upload a video that's larger than your RAM, you're going to run out of RAM. And then what happens? You're going to start paging, things start slowing to a crawl. How do we avoid that when somebody uploads, say, a 10 gigabyte file or a 20 gigabyte file? How are we going to handle that? How would we handle that? So I guess I'll still go through some examples, but it'll have to be during the Q&A. I don't know if I'll go back to these on Monday. I want to get on to the next step of things.